Retribution and forgiveness are two philosophical behaviors that don't have to be at odds with each other, yet one is often so powerful to an individual, it overcomes them and nullifies the other. And displaying the specific scenario of retribution infecting someone's every thought until it becomes who they are is a tale as old as time. But the best stories with that theme find new ways to push its limits and further test its viewer. I personally always go back to the I Am Legend novel, but there's Breaking Bad, A History of Violence. Most long-running kids animated shows have commentary on it. Hell, I'm currently rewatching Attack on Titan Season 4, if you can even call it that. Anyway, the point is, depictions of the cycle of violence are everywhere, which is good. Right now, it's a through line that is as important as ever to tell and hammer home. The problem is that everyone already knows that theme. They might not actually follow the lesson, but they've heard it time and time again. And if someone notices that a story is attempting to manipulate them into learning that lesson once again, they'll probably be apprehensive to that experience, either taking it only at surface level or not engaging with it at all. And that's where The Last of Us comes in, because its sequel managed to do something with the idea of retribution and forgiveness that no other story has been able to match for me, which might be as simple as peeling back the layers behind Ellie and Abby and their perhaps not so differing ideas of retribution, but it has untold amounts of subtext to interpret, so let's just dive into all of that, as well as just my experience playing the game. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, your nihilistic optimist, and The Last of Us is one of those properties that transcends any medium it's being told in, throwing its player, or viewer, into an emotionally charged apocalyptic adventure that's just as harrowing as it is compelling. And I've already talked about my unshaking opinion that the game itself is always going to be better than the show, and why video game adaptations in general will never be as good as the game they're adapting, which boils down to you being the playable character and therefore attaching untold levels of subconscious fondness to them, something its movie or TV show just can't come close to. And I think that idea only increases with the sequel to The Last of Us. So if you're one of those fans that absolutely hates the sequel, then what are you doing here? Just don't watch this video? Or do. Maybe I can convince you to give it another chance. And for as good as the story for The Last of Us is, and for as much as I was a member of the Pitchfork toting crew, saying that a sequel wasn't necessary and might even ruin the first story, The Last of Us 2 executes everything it sets out to do to a T and might just be better than the first. Though that argument of which is better is more of a subjective call made individually, like Alien and Aliens, Terminator and T2, or for a more modern gaming example, God of War and God of War Ragnarok. The sequel managed to step up and increase the stakes of the first so well without sacrificing any of what made the first work. And the first is just that, the OG that everything after it is influenced by. It's an apples and oranges debate, and on any given day, I might lean more to one side or the other. And today, I think Last of Us 2 is better. But I'm not here to discuss that, and I'll give you more specific spoiler warnings for the latter, not yet adapted sections of the game when the conversation moves on to them. But just to play it safe, I'd say if you haven't watched or played any of The Last of Us 2, maybe don't let me ruin the story for you. I mean, you do you, I'm not your mom, but either way, spoilers for The Last of Us 2. But before getting any further, I gotta take a step back and clearly define what I'm even talking about, because I'm sure some of you clicked on this video wondering why I was talking about retribution and not revenge. And they are synonymous for the majority of the way I'll be using them, but the one thing that elevates the word retribution for me is how it's all-encompassing. Where the idea of revenge is solely given to the connotation of hate and negativity, retribution can more easily fit every lofty ethical and moral implication inside its vague umbrella. And I know I just talked about defining these words for clarity, but I do like that indeterminate sense of openness when it comes to someone's opinion on the term, but also the word's definition itself. So what is retribution? Taking the Latin prefix and root, it literally translates to payback, but I've tended to go with Merriam-Webster's whenever attempting to clearly define a word, so I'll stick with that. And they define retribution first as the dispensing or receiving of reward or punishment, especially in the hereafter, and secondly, as something given or exacted in recompense. And in case you didn't know, that just means giving something in fair compensation, not underreacting or overreacting, just responding to an action with an equal equal or opposite reaction, Newton style. And it's very important, at least for this ongoing discussion, that the distinction is made that Ellie and Abby are both going out on these journeys for revenge, but in their eyes, it's for retribution. And they both use the same logical leaps to get there, using those not so reasonable but still not unwarranted conclusions to justify their actions, even to the point that it leads to them becoming clearly vengeful and vile, because they're not committing these wicked acts of violence for the sake of it, they're only matching the level of hate they received when they lost a loved one. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I gotta bring up the heartbreaking elephant in the room. And the hole in my heart left in his wake may not be elephant-shaped, but it sure is elephant-sized. And before everything went down, and especially in the moments leading up to it, without any explanation, just from the look on Abby's face throughout the first act, you knew she wanted Joel dead. And then, she gets the retribution she was looking for. But for us, the viewer, Joel dies. Not in the most messed up way possible, but with just enough dignity taken from him that people were pissed. I don't know about you, but I was more devastated than anything, kinda just emotionally shell-shocked. But that powerful and visceral emotional reaction was all intricately planned and laid out by the writers for a specific purpose. Like Ellie and pretty much everyone else watching, I hated Abby and every single little piece of garbage in her group. I was wronged, I was angry, and I wanted retribution. So naturally, I was all for going to Seattle to hunt them down. Of course, the show has already diverged from that exact storyline, though only slightly, because the game withholds all of Abby's reasoning until about its midpoint, and it does so for a very particular reason that I'll dive into later on. But as I've already pointed out, everyone could already guess, at the very least, an outline of what was motivating Abby. But up until it was fully revealed, we only ever got vague answers, keeping the mystery alive for that much longer. Although I do appreciate getting to know Abby and her group right at the start of season 2. Even if it's only giving its audience 5% more information, that small percentage is likely going to do wonders as far as defending the character from fan backlash. We'll still get flashbacks of Abby's dad helping out that zebra in this season or the next, or at least we better get something like that to further establish that this guy is a genuinely good person. But really, all the viewer needs to know is that Joel murdered Abby's dad. That's more than enough to make her actions understandable. And one thing I'm loving about season 2 of The Last of Us is how that very idea can be expanded on with viewpoints that aren't just Ellie's, though even hers is allowed to be given more complexity. Overall, the show has added or changed only a few ancillary details, but it also just amps up the drama in every interaction, such as how Ellie wasn't able to immediately up and go after Abby, instead being forced to sit and stew with what she was feeling. I honestly could have used more of this, but even the idea of that hate festering with no release is so impactful. That or much later on, with Dina finding out about Ellie's immunity with infinitely more drama. And since I'm already on the topic of changes from the game, a character created completely for the show is Catherine O'Hara's therapist, Gail. And as with every therapy subplot in TV, I was pretty worried the moment they introduced her. Maybe it's just because they are typically used as a crutch to tell the audience a character's deepest wishes and anxieties, but like musicals or any other similar expository narrative tool, it's bad if it's used in a lazy way, but with thought put into it, it works. And here, in The Last of Us with Gail, not just because she has her own identifiable personalities, as flawed as everyone else in this world, but also because it makes Jackson feel like more of a community, with workers in every field specializing in what they do best. And Gail just so happened to be a great therapist. And rather than her just stating the obvious in her sessions, she pushes Joel and Ellie and forces them to reassess what they are truly dealing with. And I found it fascinating how after allowing herself to gather her thoughts, Ellie stood in front of the citizens of Jackson and talked about doing what's right and dealing out justice. Because, as Gail points out, that's an obvious lie. But between Ellie and Abby, when it comes to their hate and desire for retribution, the only real difference between them being that Ellie started that journey of rage-filled retribution right as Abby completed hers. And I haven't even really mentioned the fact that there's freaky fungus zombies running around. And while that is still very important in the story, featuring an amazing Resident Evil-ish sequence much later on, but aside from that, the zombies just aren't that important. Like the playable character, to you, they're nothing more than obstacles in your path. Which is fascinating how the show has been able to utilize that to enforce how, to an objective viewer, Ellie is insane. Putting herself in the same life or death scenarios and explaining why she would do something like that. As per usual, covering up the simple thrill-seeking truth with wanting to clear out a pack of zombies or get supplies. And in the face of the more than 800 miles of zombie-infested country to trek across, Ellie and Dina arrive in Seattle on schedule without so much as a scratch on either of them, further establishing how capable and reassured they both are when it comes to surviving in this apocalyptic world. Though that confident, reassured feeling kinda goes away the minute they find out there's already a war going on in Seattle, from dead bodies, hanged bodies, and blood on a wall signifying some kind of cult. The vibes were just not there. But despite that, Ellie, Dina, and you as the player know you'll get to the next destination, because depending on how you play, Ellie is either a stealthy ninja assassin or a hero from an action movie. Yet those necessary levels as you start to get deeper into Seattle are contextualized just like the zombies, in addition to the show and game both being incredible at featuring the quieter moments of beauty that can be found amongst hunting clickers and being hunted by the citizens of Seattle, even in between the blinding feeling of murder-incited, blood-curdling hatred. And when Ellie and Dina find those moments, it proves that they really shouldn't be going out on this hunt, because for as much pain as they were feeling, it wouldn't be worth the happiness they were sacrificing by putting themselves in danger. But we don't get the full scope of the ongoing war in Seattle until episode 4 of the show, titled Day 1. And for as far into the story as I've made it, I want to slide back chronologically just a tiny bit to talk about the introduction of Isaac, who gives the viewer much more of an in into the daily life of Seattle and the hopes and dreams of who lives in it. But in the game, he's cast and placed there solely to be nothing more than a red herring. The terrifying presence of this militant leader known as Isaac is set up throughout Ellie and Abby's sequences, but we'd only ever get to see his face for seconds at a time. And when it comes to runtime he's already had in the show, after only one episode, he's gotten 10 times as much focus, not only making him into an actual character, but expanding him out into having real three-dimensional traits. Yet what I've loved most about his inclusion is being able to highlight the cycle of violence already alive and well in Seattle, a cycle that doesn't need very much input anymore, simply because the hate between the WLFs and the Seraphites have been reinforced by years upon years of continued fighting, every day of which gives one side more reason to hate the other. In fact, when it comes to that idea of a community unintentionally and even subconsciously perpetuating that cycle of violence, Isaac's interrogation scene was as powerful as it was thematically brilliant, all the way down to Isaac not wanting to get into the same old chicken and egg argument, because each group undeniably has their own justified reasons for thinking that they need to hunt down the other, and for every escalation made, that just makes the other side more justified in intensifying their attacks, over and over again, until one side is victorious, or more likely, both are just annihilated. It really shows that the hate between Ellie and Abby is only a microcosm for the millions of other cycles of violences being perpetuated everywhere. And of course, when looking at the differing steps taken by the showrunners when telling this same story, the last difference I want to take a look at is one that I've actually been waiting to be included. At this point, I'm not sure if it will be, but Pearl Jam's song Future Days is incredibly important when it comes to driving home the themes of The Last of Us 2. Even back when I was first playing the game, I did think the chorus, "If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself," was a little on the nose, but the song's clear statement of how someone can easily drown in hate when experiencing loss is so fundamental to what the story is saying. Update: one upside to taking forever to get these videos out is how I was able to see that the most recent episode, episode 5, did happen to cover that subject in a perfect way, teasing it for those who know and laying down a mystery for those that don't. And it was obvious the penultimate episode would be one consisting of flashbacks, but now I'm sure we'll see Joel teaching Ellie future days, hammering home just how much he cares. But anyway, I bring up that difference and all of the others I noticed, mainly because I just wanted to bring them up, but also because, at least at time of recording, we are now up to date with where the show is at. But knowing that we're getting one less episode from the last season, and also knowing that that last episode will 100% be a cliffhanger for season 3, I'm still very excited to see what the show is going to do. And with that said, I've definitely already spoiled plenty for you just with some of the clips used, but if you're not a game player, you might want to click off now, because I gotta talk full game spoilers, which means no holds barred. But with that out of the way, the conversation can now open up to so many other topics, like the backlash the development company, the game writers and director, and even the actors who had nothing to do with it received, or the way Season 2 has so far had a middling reception, which doesn't make any sense to me. Are we even watching the same show? But I wanted to cover spoiler stuff because I needed to talk about what I experienced when playing this particular unconventional narrative. Really, the story and themes all comes down to how we should be giving the person who wronged us mercy. In the moment, it's innate to think, hell no, and want that retribution. And it's easy to say that you'd turn your cheek when you're a bystander, especially when looking back at said event. But when you have skin in the game, it's a natural response to want what's fair. And that fairness met by finding retribution doesn't necessarily even have to be fair. All that matters is if it feels like it to that person, such as how Abby murdered Joel in such a violent and horrific way. She felt that it would even the scales, that she was just exacting karma unto a man who deserved it, and putting aside whether he did or didn't, because that's another conversation for another day, Abby also believed that getting that retribution would end the hate infecting her every thought. But that's not how it works. As I covered way at the beginning of this video, everyone is already intimately aware of the fact that acts of violence will only ever create more violence. Everyone already knows that Abby and Ellie's journeys of retribution will only end in a new cycle of cruelty being born. And knowing that, the game couldn't just dip its toes into that well-worn theme. It had to fully dive in and maybe even give an answer to its player. After all, that kind of depth and meaning was promised when a follow-up to one of the most critically praised games of all time was announced. So, what was the developer's decision? To give the player an up-close look at the dangers of retribution by testing their capacity for forgiveness. And some of the clips I chose to use may have already spoiled it, because for those observant enough, you might have noticed that there are two playable characters throughout the game, one being Ellie, and the other, of all people, being Abby. And that full switch happens entirely to pull the rug out from the player. Right at the climax of Abby infiltrating the base Ellie, Dina, and Jesse had set up, the scene cuts to black, then opens up and gives you control of a much younger Abby, something you'd had beforehand for brief levels, so I didn't get that rug pull quite yet. But after the zebra scene with Abby's dad, yet again, the scene cuts to black, and me, expecting for the game to continue on with Ellie, was flabbergasted when the text, Day 1, popped up and I was met with Abby. Immediately, I went to check my in-game backpack to see if the skills I had bought for Ellie still mattered. But it was even worse than I thought. Not only were my skills completely gone, but Abby had her own skill tree. I was upset, and I straight up did not want to play the game to get back to that theater interaction. And I instantly recognized what the game was attempting to do in making me replay those 3 days from another point of view. And I didn't even want to try and see what it had to offer. But after sleeping it off, because I didn't want to play as Abby that much, I picked up my controller again and proceeded with the game for the story. And the amount of times I intentionally killed Abby is astonishing, but once I settled in, and you do settle in, her entire portion of the game is quite possibly the most fun. I can't say the exact moment it'll click for you, because everyone has a different one, but the line that seemed to be prevailing over the others for most fans, and what absolutely worked for me, is when Abby denounces any particular side and chooses Lev, saying to her, "You're my people." And that's what Abby's sections are all about, finding a found family and choosing to protect it despite prior allegiances or promises. But more on that in just a sec, because first, you probably don't even believe me when I say Abby's sequences feature some of the most entertaining parts of the game, which, at least for me, includes but is not limited to walking across a sky bridge, having a sniper battle with someone that turns out to be Tommy, an entire Resident Evil style boss with masterful setup as you descend further and further down into the patient zero sections of a hospital, and narrowly escaping the Scar's burning village on horseback. If you haven't played it and you still stuck around past the spoiler warning, none of that will make any sense to you, but take my word for it, these clips just can't do these sequences justice. You gotta play them to know just how fun they truly are. And don't get me wrong, Ellie has plenty of entertaining sequences, from narrowly escaping an army of wolves, to being shoved out of a window by a clicker into a river, to speeding away from a horde of zombies and crashing a truck into that same river. Or possibly another river, I don't know. But the overall game is still a lot of fun. Well, I don't know if fun is the right word, with how heavy the subject material is, but I'm certainly engaged. And like I mentioned just before, once I stopped putting Abby in stupid situations and watching her die over and over again, I eventually got carried away with the engaging level design and world building The Last of Us thrives in, and that's really what the game was trying to do. Because that same psychology I recently made a whole video about, with you, the player, subconsciously connecting to the playable character, reared its head. And I hated myself for it at first, but I was starting to get endeared to Abby. Yet it wasn't so much caring for her. It was the fact that she was caring for others, and me vicariously forming that relationship through Abby. Because Lev and Yara might be unestablished characters right at the start of Abby's 3 days in Seattle, but by the end of those harrowing days, both felt like necessary inclusions to the Last of Us world. Which is why Abby's line, "You're my family," works so well. And I remember a specific critique of the Cosmonaut Variety Hour, a channel that I by and large enjoy, yet he didn't appreciate having his time wasted when it came to Yara's whole plotline. But I fundamentally disagree with that. Sure, with hindsight, of course it was a waste of time to go through all that trouble to get her the necessary medicine. However, Abby isn't a future teller. She cared for her new little sisters she just took under her wing and wanted to protect them. And as you go through all that trouble, you'll slowly begin to endear to them just the same. And I feel like I should state it one more time just to hammer it home that much further, that the point of the game is to have incredibly well thought out linear exploration and gripping stealth, but the point of the narrative is all about testing the player's capacity for forgiveness. And I'm not saying those who hate the game immediately fail that test, but is telling whenever someone criticizes the game without anything constructive being part of the conversation. There's plenty of legitimate constructive criticism about the game, like that Cosmonaut Variety Hour video I mentioned before, but especially surrounding the release of Season 2 of the show, too much of the conversation has been about things that simply don't matter to The Last of Us's story. What does matter is representing the cycle of violence and depicting the deep, nuanced complexity of how to stop it, which is often out of our hands and beyond the scale that any one person is capable of tackling, but on an individual basis, it is possible to fight, though that answer is somewhat ironic, because all that's necessary is that you don't fight. Earlier, I talked about finding those inevitable brief moments of happiness, and if Ellie or Abby was willing to put effort into having more of them, something they could easily do, they'd have that happiness. However, they're more preoccupied with revenge, putting effort into that. Which is why, by the time the narrative got back to that theater climax, I was lost attempting to decipher what was the right thing to do, besides just walking away. But at the end of the day, I was still somewhat siding with Ellie, because she's the OG, yet was forced to play the section as Abby, making for a boss battle that I really didn't want to win, instilling the idea even further of the vagueness of an enemy or a bad guy. So not only should you be careful who you establish as a threat or worse, an enemy, but you should also question the very idea of what an enemy is. Because it's not even you that decides, it's your hate that decides. And after hours of playing as Abby, the game gives you back Ellie with all of those upgrades I was sad to have lost. But by then, I'd changed. I no longer needed that retribution and wanted Ellie to give up her hunt. But she hadn't gone through the same eye-opening journey we, the player, had, and she still needed to see Abby dead. And like a lot of the rest of the game, playing that last section left me with an uneasy, emotionally lost feeling. But that emotional response was exactly what the writers and developers wanted. They wanted me to look at Ellie, after having and leaving her happy ending, question why the hell she was still on her self-destructive hunt. And she wasn't stopping because it was going to require one hell of a shock to the system to wake her up from the tunnel vision she was experiencing. But it's hard to think of anything else when all you want is retribution.
Look, everything that we've been fighting for, all the sacrifices, all of the horrific, all of that is justified with this one act.
If this was your daughter, what would you do?
Come on.
But those are my thoughts on the themes and story of The Last of Us 2. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope I've imparted at least a little bit of what I took away from the game. And if you're like me, and you're enjoying Season 2 of the show, despite some legitimate complaints that there is less weight behind the toll of Ellie's decision to do all of this, yet let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.